We are the resistance. But does resistance mean that there can be no collaboration with the occupying force? Let's explore that question in today's episode.
Attention, attention. Stay tuned for an incoming transmission.
This is Radio Free Ecclesia, the pirate radio broadcast to the citizens of God's kingdom living in enemy-occupied territory. It's good to be back after a week off. Last week was a very hectic week for me. I had a lot of different things clamoring for my attention, and so I just wanted to get those all resolved before I got back into recording videos for this channel. In addition to that, this whole YouTube thing is still fairly new to me. I'm learning a lot about the production side and getting videos ready on a weekly basis. And so I wanted to take a little time to self-scout myself and evaluate what I had done up to that point in terms of quality and content and figure out where I want to go from there. So hopefully, moving forward, I can continue to improve quality and produce videos that are useful to you. And that's where I'd say, too, I welcome your feedback. Please communicate with me. Give me feedback, both critical and uplifting, to help me know the best way that I can serve you through this channel and through these videos. So with that in mind, let's talk about what it means to be the resistance. In Jesus' day, God's people, Israel, had been living under foreign occupation for centuries. As many of you know, the first force to occupy them were the Babylonians. They conquered Israel and forced them to live as a client state to them for a very long time. But the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, and Israel was just folded into the Persian Empire and then had to live under their occupation. The Persians were ultimately defeated by the Greeks, and so Israel was again just folded into the Greek Empire and forced to live under their occupation for many, many centuries. Now, the Israelites ultimately rebelled against the Greek overlords and very briefly won a period of independence, but it was very short-lived. And so after that, they came under the rule of the Romans. And it's the Roman occupational force that defines Israel's lived daily experience at the time of Jesus. Now, during this time, different groups of Israelites adopted different strategies for living and even resisting this occupational force, this occupying force. And what I want to do over the course of the next few episodes is look at each one of these groups and their strategy for dealing with the occupation. And what I want to do is see if there is anything we can learn from them, and especially to see how Jesus responded to and interacted with these forces so that we can look to them and learn from them so that we can understand our response to the occupational force we live under, this rogue power that currently rules over this earth. The first group I want to look at are the Sadducees. Who were the Sadducees? Well, at the time of Jesus, the Sadducees were the priestly group. The high priest and the priests who were responsible for the temple were the primary people who made up the Sadducees, as well as their retainers and other people associated with the upkeep, the maintenance, and the temple responsibilities. These were also ultimately the political power, the aristocracy of Jesus' time. Now, if you go back to the Old Testament, this was not the role of the priests. The priests were never meant to be the ruling party. The priests were supposed to be a separate group of people, the Levites, living in and among the tribes, to serve them in a variety of ways. The priests were the Levites were the ones to teach people Torah, to help them understand what it meant to live out their lives as God's people. And then you had the high priest and other priests associated with the tabernacle and then the temple, who were responsible for the daily sacrifices and other activities associated with the temple and the tabernacle. But what happened after the exile was Israel no longer had a king. They didn't have a governing class that was native to them. They would have governors or other representatives appointed by the occupying empire, but they didn't have their own ruling class. And so in the absence of that, in this vacuum, the priests just stepped in and served as the de facto leaders of the people. And this continued after the time of the exile. Over time, these people began to gain more and more influence, more and more power. They were the ones who were working directly with that occupying force. So that by the time you get to the time of Jesus, the Sadducees, this priestly party, is the ruling party for the people. Not only do they have the religious power, but they're also wielding political power and a tremendous influence with the ruling force, the Romans. So how did the Sadducees respond to the occupying force, the Romans? Their strategy was one of collaboration. They believed that it was in their best interests and the interest of the nation to work closely with the occupying force. In so doing, they hoped to maximize the potential for prosperity and for flourishing, and they hoped to be able to influence the policies of the occupying force in a way that would bring benefit to the people. They saw the occupying force as there for the foreseeable future, so their response is, let's work with them. And so that was the response of the Pharisees. Let's collaborate. Let's work closely with them. And it did work for them. The Sadducees were able to maintain their positions of power, to maintain their status with the Romans and among their own people. They were able to continue to offer up sacrifices in the temple and to basically establish a business as normal kind of environment during this time of occupation. So how might we assess the efforts of the Sadducees? Well, we can begin by looking at the writings of contemporary historians from that time period, specifically a Jewish historian named Josephus. Josephus doesn't tell us a lot about the Sadducees, but he does give us a couple of interesting pieces of information. We know, for example, that the Sadducees were viewed as the party of the wealthy. Their collaboration with the Romans had allowed the Sadducees to acquire power and influence, land, and wealth. And so they became the aristocracy, the wealthy and political elite. Josephus also indicates that they weren't particularly popular with the regular people. In fact, this assessment is confirmed by another group called the Essenes. The Essenes were a breakaway group made up of people, some of whom probably came out of the priestly class. And even though they don't necessarily talk about the Sadducees in particular, they do talk about the priests in the temple. And their assessment is not particularly positive. They believe that the priesthood had become corrupt. And so they were looking forward to a time when the priesthood would be renewed and cleansed. And so the general picture we get of the priesthood, the Sadducees, from both the Bible and sources outside the Bible is one of corruption. We read that the priests would often take land from widows, seize their land in payment for debts. Their collaboration with the Romans seems to have made them more like the Romans. And so our first look at them is that collaboration, though nobly motivated originally as a way for them to maintain identity and work with the ruling powers, seems to have compromised their mission, their priestly mission, and even their identity as the people of God. So, what do we learn from Jesus' interaction with the Sadducees? Clearly, he didn't join with them. Jesus was not a Sadducee, and so he didn't join in their efforts to collaborate with the Romans. Interestingly enough, though, Jesus didn't overtly try to take down the Sadducees. You see, at this time, the Sadducees were not a particularly popular group with most of the Jews. People saw them as collaborators, they saw them as corrupt, and so there was a really strong desire among the Jewish people to see cleansing happen with the priesthood. It wasn't just the Essenes who wanted to see the priesthood cleansed, but the masses did as well. You might say that they wanted someone to come in and drain the swamp in Jerusalem. And yet, Jesus didn't do that. He didn't join them, but neither did he try to take them out the way that people hoped the Messiah would. The closest we see Jesus come to any kind of political activism, we might say, was when he cleansed the temple. But that didn't do anything to change that ruling party or to undo any of the things that they were engaged in. In fact, the only thing it did was bring their wrath upon him, because Jesus had the gall to invade their turf. And that's where we see that the collaboration of the Sadducees with this ruling party was ultimately their undoing. Not only did they lose their sense of mission as priests, they ended up actually missing out on the very work that God was doing. They had become very comfortable in their position of power. They had become very comfortable with their wealth. They had become comfortable with the status quo. It was working for them. And so when God was moving in their midst, when God sent his Son into the world, rather than get on board with what God was doing, they ended up opposing it. They rejected God, they rejected his Son, and ended up looking just like the occupying force. The Sadducees looked more like the Romans than they did the people of God, and even ended up collaborating with them to execute the very Son of God. So what can we learn from the Sadducees? I'm sure that if you would have talked to them, they would have had many arguments for their approach to the occupation that they did. I'm sure that to them it was logical for them to collaborate. Obviously, it worked for them. They were able to have positions of wealth and power and status, and so I'm sure they felt like it was in their best interest to do so. But I think in the final assessment, what we see is that collaboration ultimately compromised their commitment to God, to his mission, and put them in a position to where they ended up missing out on the very thing that God was trying to do in their midst. And so, as we think about ourselves today, as people who are living during a time of occupation, during a time of exile, as citizens of God's kingdom, living in the midst of a rogue regime in this world, what should we do? How should we approach that? Well, I think we need to learn the lesson of the Sadducees. We may think that we can work with them, that we can collaborate and try to influence them for good, influence them in a way that hopefully will bring benefit to God's people, and maybe even bring benefit to ourselves. But I think that there's a danger there, a danger that that collaboration will not result in us looking more like the people of God, but looking more like that rogue regime, the occupying force. I don't know that we are any better than those Sadducees, who probably started out meaning well with noble aspirations, but ended up falling short of those. I think the danger is too great. I think we need to resist the impulse to collaborate, no matter how appealing it might be, no matter how logical it may be. What we want more than anything is to remain true to God's mission, to be His people who are a light to this world. And the danger of collaboration undermining our success in that mission is just too great. I think it's imperative that we learn the lesson of the Sadducees and realize that collaboration is not a path forward in our resistance to the occupying force in this world.